Welcome to the latest entry in the Diplomats webinar series. I'm so glad that you could join us today. We'll be diving into the discussion of COVID-19 origins. We're trying to separate fact from fiction and science from speculation today, and the experts joining us are uniquely qualified to help us understand this issue, and I am very thrilled to have each of them joining us. Today we have Dr. Maciej Boni, who is an associate professor of biology at Penn State University's Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics. So thank you for joining us, Maciej. We also have Dr. Gigi Gronvall, who's a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Gigi, good to have you with us as well. And we have Dr. Yanzhong Huang, who is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also a professor and director of global health studies at Seton University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Yanzhong, thank you for joining us as well.
For having me.
So as you can see, we have a range of scientific expertise, but also some political expertise. So we'll be touching on this from a variety of perspectives. But first, Dr. Boni is going to start us off with a brief overview of what the science tells us about the origins of COVID-19, what we know and what we don't know at this point. So Maciej, please take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Shannon. So just to ground us and get us all on the same page, I'll start with a little bit of the background and vocabulary around the evolution and the epidemiology of the virus and sort of the earliest couple months of its transmission. So the SARS-CoV-2 is a beta coronavirus, and its subgenus is something called sarbecovirus. And at the time of the outbreak, there were only about 70 other sarbecovirus genomes available in public databases. So when the virus genome was first released, there really wasn't very much to compare it to. And when you have that small number of genomes, you can't really place the virus very precisely in a genealogy because you're not guaranteed that anything you have out there publicly is close to what you just found. The closest virus that was available at the time, so this is January, February 2020, is a virus that many of you may already be familiar with. It's called RATG13 or RATG13. And that virus is 96.2% identical at the nucleotide level to SARS-CoV-2, but that's not very close in evolutionary terms. So that put the ancestor of these two viruses back in the 1960s or 1970s. So what that means is that in the 1960s or 1970s in southern China, presumably, there was a reservoir of these sarbecoviruses circulating, and that reservoir gave rise to multiple lineages of other descendant viruses, one of which led to SARS-CoV-2, one of which led to RATG13, and probably, but nobody knows, there were dozens and dozens of other lineages that have survived in bat populations somewhere, but they weren't sampled. So on this lineage, now we found about a dozen other additional viruses, but none that are substantially closer to SARS-CoV-2. So the picture remains largely the same. SARS-CoV-2 is sort of an isolated virus, and there are other bat viruses that are sort of 3% to 6% further away from it genetically. Additionally, coronaviruses recombine. So putting together the genealogy is a little difficult. A virus can be a mosaic virus. Essentially, viruses can have sex inside cells. They can exchange genetic information and create a hybrid or a mosaic virus that's a combination of its parents. So when you look at the origins, you have to look at multiple segments of the virus and make sure they sort of, all the origin questions match up in about the same way. So nevertheless, no matter how you look at it, whether different segments or different viruses, everything takes us back basically to horseshoe bat populations in the 1960s, 1970s, and just a few lineages from these horseshoe bat populations that we can identify today. So epidemiologically, SARS-CoV-2 was discovered or announced on December 30th, 2019, when a cluster of 41 pneumonia cases was reported by authorities in Wuhan to the China CDC, to China's WHO country office, and also to the UK organization ICERIC, which is an organization that collects and standardizes clinical data to make these types of epidemiological investigations easier. About 2/3, if I'm remembering correctly, of these cases were linked back to the now famous Huanan seafood market. And the earliest symptoms in that data set dated back to December 1st. So even at the very beginning in January 2020, we knew that if the earliest symptoms onset was December 1st, November 2019 was the likely time of the originator event or the zoonotic events. And more data have come in since then. So genomic data have come in, and additional epidemiological data have come in. So there's now maybe 160 or 170 cases in that initial December period that we have data on, or the WHO has data on. And both the epidemiological data and the genetic data of the earliest genomes sort of point back to October, November. Mid-October to mid-November is the most likely range for the originator event that would have been the first seeding event of this outbreak, then epidemic, and then pandemic. The Huanan seafood market's not guaranteed to be the originator event, and there's a couple lines of evidence supporting this. First is that the earliest symptoms from the Huanan seafood market date back to December 10th, indicating that unless there were unreported cases from that market, the originator events from November and October would have taken place somewhere else. And also this very recent discovery from last month by Jesse Bloom's group from Seattle, or just Jesse himself, on these deleted sequences point to the fact that the Huanan sequences are 3 mutations further away from the most ancestral sequences. So 3 mutations isn't that many, but it's enough to suggest that the Huanan seafood market was maybe the 3rd or the 4th generation of cases. I'm guessing a little bit here, but likely not the originator location or events. We do know that some of the other initial cases had contact with other markets, and so it is possible that there was some originating animal population, that this originating animal population was imported in October and November into Wuhan, and it could have been easily imported into multiple markets, initiating multiple crossover events. There's no strong evidence suggesting that this would either have to be true or have to be false. In my opinion, this is sort of on the table as an equal hypothesis of how the original events could have happened. And I think this takes us to a conversation that we're going to get back to quite a lot today, and that is that there was not one Huanan seafood market. The city of Wuhan does not have just several live wild animal markets. As anybody that's worked in East Asia or Southeast Asia knows, that there are hundreds of these markets that individuals do their regular groceries at every day. In urban and developed parts of East and Southeast Asia, these markets are covered. They have opening and closing times. They have hygiene regulations and stalls that you rent. And in more rural and less developed parts of East and Southeast Asia, there are also more stalls, and there are roadside sellers. So individuals selling their household poultry, for example, on the side of the road without any stall or license or permit. So when you look at the markets themselves, the numbers get into the hundreds. And if you want to include roadside sellers or roadside stalls, these numbers literally get into the thousands in a large city. And of course, it does depend on the level of economic development in the city that we're looking at. So as we all know, there's been renewed discussion as to the origins of the virus. I think that the animal links are much more probable simply due to the numbers of contacts that range into the thousands or millions, depending on who you want to count in sort of the regular animal-human contacts at markets, whereas the laboratory origin hypothesis doesn't have these types of numbers behind it. The rate of laboratory accidents or leaks is probably in the single digits per year. This is not something I'm qualified to assess, but I think Gigi and Yanzhong will have a few things to say about this. So thanks, that's it for me, and I'll pass over to Gigi.
Thank you. Should I just go? So thank you for that background, and I'll launch in with a few introductory remarks. So I was asked to talk a little bit about, like, why is it important? You know, why do we care how this terrible disease started? The obvious answer is because we want to prevent it from happening again. And so there's been a lot of speculation about different ways that this pandemic started, and they force you to different conclusions of how we should act now to prevent it from happening again. But you know, we can't go back to the videotape. We can't go and see like the bat emerging from, you know, where it lived and infecting some raccoon dog and getting eaten by somebody and butchered and having infected that person. We can't go back to see exactly how it started. So we have to infer with clues, and a lot of these clues take some time to develop, to uncover, and it's on a different time scale than a lot of the politics involved here. And so with this slower pace of science, and we have a lot of room for people to speculate, and we have a lot of room for people to bring their own preconceived notions of how things started to the table, and then there's like the factor that not everybody is acting in good faith, and so it's not like everybody is trying to figure out, well, how can we sincerely prevent this from happening again? No, that's unfortunately not the case, and a lot of people have agendas at play here, and so that's why it's important. My own background is as a scientist who turned to policy, and I have a background in immunology, and I've worked in all levels of high containment and with different viruses, and I've been following biosafety and working in biosafety for a long time, and biosafety policy. There's a lot of complexity in all of these issues that's not appropriately captured when people talk about the science here, as you just heard. It's not a simple story when we're talking about monitoring mutations from that occur in the virus from the passage of one person to the next. So what you heard is that we do have some evidence that this did emerge from a natural reservoir. We have an amplification event at the market. We have samples that were isolated from the market that are SARS-CoV-2. We have a history of this happening. 3/4 of all diseases come from an animal source, and this happens more and more. And for decades now, we've been talking about the importance of One Health, that people and animals and the environment are all connected, and everybody's kind of like, yay, that's fantastic. We all agree with that, but it's actually really hard to do something about those interconnections because it requires dealing with land use and people that are making a lot of money off of deforestation aren't really interested in how that might contribute to disease progression and more zoonotic spillover events. So anyway, I want to say that just what do we need to do? There's a lot of things that are important here. I've said to people that biosafety is important. I don't think that a laboratory accident, that there is as much evidence for a laboratory accident causing this pandemic, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing more to increase biosafety worldwide. There are lots of things we can do. But I would be wary of people who say, well, there's no controls on any of this science. It's like, that's just not true. But throughout the world, biosafety has been underfunded, and there are steps that we can take to increase protections for laboratory workers. So my final thing was, we already heard about some of the animals that were at the infamous market. But there's been a lot of talk of smoking guns in the genome and what that might mean for the origin of this virus. For me, the smoking gun was on page 98 of the WHO investigation of this of the origins of the virus, where Chinese officials asserted that there were no illegal animals at the market involved, and that is and when I read that, I thought, if this is the mayor of Boston saying that, I would say that's complete baloney. And never mind where there's a lot of any other place in the world. And so I think now it has been clear that there are lots of animals that could have potentially transmitted SARS-CoV-2, and we're not going to be able to trace them as easily as all that because people don't want to go to jail. And people don't want to be known for having broken the law knowingly. And so it's going to be a challenge to actually get to the origin. but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying, because whether it's SARS, Ebola, or Nipah, or Hendra, or MERS, or SARS-CoV-2, we see that that nature has lots of unpleasant surprises for us, and we need to get a handle on that in a much more serious way than pointing fingers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi. So you and Maciej have given us a great overview of where the science has us, but as you noted, unfortunately, science is not the only consideration at play in this investigation. And we're going to turn to Yanzhong to talk us through politics and how politics has started interfering with this essentially scientific question.
Thank you, Shannon. I think this order, right? This panel is arranged as perfect. As the only non-scientist in the panel, I'm going to talk about the politics, essentially how this so-called lab escape theory, right, has been politicized and make a thorough, independent, transparent investigation of the outbreak, which is so important, as Gigi pointed out, by preventing for the next outbreak. Right? Unfortunately, we're making such investigation even more difficult because of that politicization. So I'm going to briefly just talk about the history, right? How step by step, this issue has been politicized. So from the very beginning, we know, right? It's just when that outbreak occurred, I, like many other people, it was just so difficult, right? To resist the temptation of making the connection, between, right, the virus, right, and the Wuhan lab, right? After all, right, this is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, houses the lab, which it's actually China's only biosafety level 4 lab, handling some of the world's most dangerous pathogens. And Senator Cotton, right, certainly make that connection publicly, right? I think in mid-February 2020, right, when he pointed out, right, that the Wuhan lab, this could be caused by lab accident, although he didn't say, well, this is like deliberate cover up or intentional release, right, of the virus. But overall, right, despite all the speculations, that the lab escape hypothesis was largely, right, marginalized, and considered a conspiracy theory, right? But the problem is that it never disappeared, right, in social media, right, on both sides, but in the United States and China, right? And sometimes, right, this theory become so powerful, when you are like every day, right, bombarded by these theories. Even some of the leading public health experts may fell prey to their influence. So this is background. When you saw how on February 28th, 2020, that like Dr. Zhong Nanshan, the public face of China's crusade against the epidemics, make that surprising announcement, that Wuhan was the origin point of the outbreak. It doesn't necessarily mean, Wuhan was where the virus was first detected. It doesn't necessarily mean it was origin point of the outbreak, right? And then you saw that the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, pick up that the comment and use that to refute, right? This connection between the virus and Wuhan, as well as the lab escape theory, right? And so, that issue from the very beginning was like entangled with this politicization of the origins of the pandemic. Especially when the U.S. top diplomats, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, increasingly try to link the virus to China. So that is the in mid-March, you saw how the Zhao Lijian tried to promote that theory, that there was a lab escape, from the U.S. military lab. Even was suggested that it was like the U.S. Military athletes, brought the virus to Wuhan. Although you can easily tell there's like incoherence in that argument, right? Because if you say, right, that this lab escape, it was extremely unlikely, coming from a Chinese lab, why, what make it would be easier, right, to escape from a U.S. military lab, right? And, but essentially after Zhao's remarks, Trump, doubled down, right, this rhetoric, right, by routinely referring, this to the so-called Chinese virus. Sometimes he used also the term of Kung flu, right, to refer to the pathogen of the outbreak, right. So that essentially challenges the official Chinese narrative, on the successful pandemic response, right? According to New York Times, they run an article, talking about, like the three components of the Chinese official narrative. One of them is about, the origin of the outbreak. Basically was dispute, right? Wuhan and China in general as the origin point of the outbreak, and that makes sense, certainly, right? Logically, right? When you were trying to promote a successful story, right? That the Wuhan or China is still considered the origin point of the outbreak. That would make that story not so successful, because if you will find, right, this is just like someone was talking and bragging about how successful they are in putting out a file, right, that the more efficiently, more quickly than his neighbors, and it turned out it was that person, right, that started the fire, right. So yeah, that see how that this thing becomes so politicized, and that political stakes unfortunately become even higher in April 2020, when Australia was calling for international investigation of the outbreak, and Trump officially promoted, the lab escape theory, right? So that the sort of, this game was played out at a whole new level, right? China accepted the WHO, mission, to the country, but they try to influence the World Health Organization investigation in a way, so that it won't, contradict its official narrative. Right? You heard the story, right? The news reports, right? When the U.S. proposed like 13 out of like this 25 names, submitted to China for approval, right? None of them were accepted, right? Instead, they picked a U.S. citizen, who happened to have close, collaboration with the Wuhan lab, and was also found to be playing a key role in drafting, that February 2020 Lancet letter, basically calling the lab escape, a conspiracy theory. So clearly there's like a conflict of interest there. Right, and then you look this WHO findings, right? The stayed, right? They in China for 4 weeks, including 2 weeks on site, but only like stayed essentially like 3 hours, right? In the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? Clearly, right? They didn't pay attention to that the lab escape. Or examine that lab escape theory seriously, So, when the WHO findings came out, right, suggesting that lab escape was extremely unlikely, it essentially backfired, right, internationally, right? Even the WHO DG, by Dr. Tedros, right, sort of undermined the findings of the WHO team, by saying everything. Every option still on the table, right? In the beginning, in early May, that with that publication, I think of Nicholas Wade's article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. You see how this lab escape theory resurfaced, and revitalized, removed from its pariah status and now became a legitimate and incredible hypothesis to examine. So, that is the sort of like the history of the politicization of the lab escape theory. I will stop there, maybe to whether maybe later we could talk about more about this.
I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions from the audience, and people can put their questions into the Q&A box and I'll field them from there. But that was a wonderful explanation of the political narratives, Yanzhong. Thank you very much for bringing that up. And I want to kind of take this back to Maciej and Gigi for a scientific take. It seems like we have two competing theories that have been held up by politicians. On the one hand, you have politicians in the US, some of whom have been promoting the lab leak theory. And then on the other hand, you have officials in China who have been promoting the theory that actually this virus didn't originate in China at all. It was somehow imported, whether inadvertently or intentionally from outside. So Maciej, if you want to start first, you give us your 2 cents. How likely are these two theories? Should we be paying attention to them at all? And then Gigi, you can chime in as well.
So we're talking about the two most extreme theories, the lab leak on one side and the importation from other countries on the other side. Well, I mean, there's no evidence for either of these. I mean, I hate to be so direct as a scientist, but for the importation into China, the evidence that was initially shown were antibody results from late 2019 in Italy and maybe from a few other countries. But antibody results are not specific enough to determine that somebody was infected with SARS-CoV-2, and none of the epidemiology matches up with it. So it would be impossible, and this is like a 1 in a billion impossible, for there to have been cases in Italy in October and November, but for the wave of hospitalizations in Italy to have started in February. So nothing about the virus suggests that it could have taken that path, except an extraordinary amount of unlucky mutation in the first week of February that would have led to a wave of hospitalization in a couple Italian cities. Excuse me, the lab leak theory I've talked about a little bit. I mean, what we don't have is a piece of positive evidence that there could have been a laboratory accident. So there's a lot of discussion of a cover-up, but a cover-up isn't evidence, because if there was a laboratory accident and a cover-up, then you would see no evidence. But if there wasn't a laboratory accident and there was no cover-up, you would also see no evidence. So you can't claim the lack of evidence as evidence of a cover-up. You could do that with anything: the Kennedy assassination, the Challenger explosion. And the other argument is the proximity, which maybe Gigi and Yanzhong can talk about this as well, but this has also never been a convincing argument that the WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, is close. It's in the same city as some of the originator markets where the initial outbreaks were identified. But again, this is the equivalent of finding a murder weapon, say a knife, and then immediately going to a kitchen supply store and saying, well, you have knives, so it must have been you. And they would rightly tell you that they have safety procedures, their knives are locked up, and also that everybody else in the community has knives. So what you have to do at that point is you need one additional piece of evidence. You need a motive, a break-in, a safety trail, or an audit trail showing that something went wrong, or a missing knife, that something went wrong and there's a reason to pursue that line of evidence. And that's what we don't have. We don't have that one independent line of evidence outside of a cover-up or just a proximity argument.
Okay, so I mean, we have to go with what kind of evidence you have, and so I've talked to a number of people who's like, well, it's we don't have evidence for either theory or any of these theories. It's just not true. It does require being able to, the whole lab leak theory requires there to be such a virus that was being held by the lab, and we don't have evidence of that yet. Will we ever? That's a matter of who knows. But for the investigation that we have so far, any of the viruses that were held by the lab don't match what then became a pandemic. The people say, well, you could use gain of function, but gain of function, we could talk about that, but it's not actually a magic wand, and you can't transform a virus. You just can't get there from any virus that we know that was held by the lab. So, then, people say, well, I see in the chat, they should open up and allow all past records to be examined. Well, this is if say they did allow all past records to be examined and all laboratory notebooks to be examined, and there was nothing there, there would always be that element of doubt for people who say, well, they probably had it and they removed the evidence. So I think there might be less incentive for the laboratory to agree to such a investigation. I've participated in a few kind of after action reports and investigations following biosafety or other incidents. I was part of the team that investigated the inadvertent anthrax mailing that the U.S. Department of Defense did in 2014, where they had a program where they were developing, they were growing up lots of anthrax, killing it with radiation, and then sending it to developers for diagnostic purposes and so forth. So they ended up, unfortunately, they didn't completely irradiate the anthrax, and so ended up sending live samples to most states in the country and quite a few countries. And for participating in that investigation, I was the only non-US government person that was on that team. And I'm an American citizen. It is highly unlikely, for example, that the US would have allowed any foreign national to be part of such a team. And so this is where science and real politics kind of meet up, because the US, if something like this if there were charges against a US lab, would not allow that. And so the US has in the past pushed around some countries and gotten them to open up their records, but none of those countries were China or Russia even.
Okay, thank you both for going over some of the fringe theories, which I think unfortunately tend to attract the most attention. I want to return a little bit to the political side of things. Obviously, we saw many reports about how Chinese officials mishandled the early stage of the pandemic. Officials in Wuhan in particular not wanting to make a big deal out of it, trying to cover up, in some cases, the information that we have. And the Chinese government has a reputation for this sort of thing, unfortunately, abroad. So how much of that is coloring this discussion? If we had seen this virus emerge in, let's say Indonesia or Australia, would we be having the same sort of discussion? How much of this do you think is tied to existing perceptions of the Chinese government as being secretive and closed off? And maybe Yanzhong, this is a good place to start with you.
Sure, be happy to. As Shannon, I just that you pointed out, that there's this history, right, in terms of how the government, especially the local governments, handle the disease outbreaks in the country, right? Especially if you compare, excuse me, I need some water. Okay. Especially if you compare, right, how the government handled the SARS outbreak and the COVID outbreak, right? I'm talking about the initial stages, right? When the local governments were facing, like a novel pathogen, right? Well, this certainly what is, like everywhere, right? Not just China, Indonesia, you talk about Australia, right? They could always, people make mistakes because you're dealing with something unknown, but but if you look at SARS and then COVID, there's also mistakes, that could be avoided, right? In terms of like when we talk about cover up, right? In terms of inaction, right? Well, this is recognized by the Chinese government, right? In the SARS, right? clearly, right, that when they already knew, right, that there was something dangerous that was spreading very rapidly, right, in the country, right? I still have the Minister of Health, basically say, well, China is still safe, right? Everything is under control, right? And similarly, right, they saw this parallel, right, in the COVID, right? The latter, right, that the local government, I think the mayor of Wuhan himself admitted, right, before he could, disclose the outbreak, you need to get the permission from the up level, right? So indicating, right, there was lack of, response, but this is more politically related, and the Chinese media, right, the Taisheng, for example, also revealed stories, right? That is how, there's like grassroots, right, the healthcare workers, try, actually work very hard, right, to alert, right, the government officials, about, this coming disaster, but, this is all stonewalled, essentially. So, that actually, make the government official narrative, which interestingly try to eliminate, right, this initial, right, mishandling of the outbreak, that less convincing, right, and also make this some of the conspiracy theories sort of more convincing, right, because people could naturally say, well, there's a lack of transparency, right? You want, and if you don't have anything to cover up, why, you were, not so cooperative, right, in terms of allowing the WHO, international experts, to do the investigation. So I think this trust is indeed a major concern here that sort of undermine, the credibility of the official narrative. And certainly, when they involve also something biosafety related, or even this like this dark theory, right, that's being generated in terms of developing biological weapons, right? Because the very nature of the biological weapons program is characterized with secrecy, right? You are clandestinely by developing something illegitimate or illegal, right? So that makes this kind of politicization, right, even more attractive, right?
Shannon, I've got a question for Gigi and Yanzhong on this topic, if we have a minute.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So both of you, when we talk about the politicization and transparency, and we go back and we look at the cover up in late 2002 of the initial SARS cases, and then it seemed to me and to other scientists that there was a lesson learned from that moment. And a good example of that is the 2013 outbreaks of H7N9 influenza in central China. And those outbreaks were identified in the middle of February 2013, and they were reported at the end of March openly and transparently. And it seemed like a good moment for transparency and disease reporting between China and the international community. So how do you guys view these last 20 years? How did you view that moment? And did you think transparency has gone up and then back down, or has it stayed flat? What would some of the motivations be about not being transparent in these situations in 2019 or 2020?
You want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the transparency has definitely increased, as has scientific interest in taking care of these kinds of outbreaks, for sure. And cooperation has gone up as well. We would not be in a position where we would have known the sequence of the virus as quickly. We wouldn't have had to handle early days if there wasn't more transparency than there was in 2002. And I think, the U.S., when they offered help, they were like, there was a big change between 2020 and 2002, and what kind of, how China was able to respond to the pandemic. But people are people. I I think, it is potentially embarrassing to have the same thing happen as, that was not taken care of in 2002 or 2020 as in 2002. There are laws on the books for sure to prevent the sale of wildlife, but clearly there's just a lot of money at stake here, and when it comes to local officials that might want to turn a blind eye to something that is an economic interest in their provinces, you can see how interests would align to allowing this illegal activity to occur or not look into it too closely, and take care of all the furry animals that were being sold in markets that did not have the proper permits. So I think it's a natural inclination to want to try and solve a problem and not have to get in trouble for it. And so this is something that lots of local officials around the world have done, where there's an issue of an infectious disease. Well, we'll take care of it. We've got it. And then things spread a little bit beyond where it can be taken care of. And this is why we have reporters, and this is why we have we have scientists who are have their duties to report these things, even if it's bad news. But this kind of conflict it's not just seen in China, it's also seen in every place.
Well, I'm glad, Maciej, you raised that question. After SARS, right, you have seen like tons of literature basically talking about how SARS was like a watershed, right, in terms of how China deal with like outbreaks, how China choose to interact with outside world, right? It is true, right? As Gigi has pointed out, China has become more transparent in terms of sharing disease-related information. It has become more cooperative, with its neighbors, international community, right? In handling, right, the global health security issues in general and disease outbreaks in particular, and in a way, what this H7N9, right, that is the outbreak is sort of, reinforced our perception, right, that China has become fully transparent, that, this international, cooperation, between China and the international community. It's not going to be an issue in the future, because actually, right after the outbreak of H7N9, right, the China, like I think within 24 hours, maybe shared the virus samples, with the United States and the WHO, I believe. But and also China has promulgated all these laws and regulations that encourage, right, the transparency, and international cooperation, in the wake of the SARS outbreak. But there are two problems right here, right? The first, as Gigi said, well, this is, you have politicians, naturally, but not just China, in the United States too. We have seen how politicians, try to downplay, the seriousness of the problem, the risk, right? It's involved, right? Trump certainly is a very good example here. And secondly, right, we also, I think, fail to look at this, all this, if you compare this different, this kind of like cover up, downplaying, right? There's some, like maybe in the United States, you cannot say, well, this is systematic, right? After all, we have, like independent media, right? They basically can say, well, the Trump is lying, right? They were wrong. But certain countries, have this political institutional issues, that make that kind of cover up more likely when we talk about the upward mobility. Upward accountability. When you have local government officials, only accountable to their superior, immediate superiors, they have strong incentives, to make them look good, not to report anything bad. Right? There's also this concern about social political stability in its jurisdiction. Right, this is what happened in Wuhan, right? When you have these two most important political events, they call two sessions, right? You saw how the local government officials refrained from reporting about the case numbers, right? So, and the surveillance system is another example, right? After SARS, when China has developed, the world's largest, the web-based, surveillance system, that they were very proud. In fact, if you watch the BBC documentary, right, the Chinese CDC director proudly announced, right, what happened in SARS during SARS is not going to happen anymore. Right, because we have the world's, the most effective system, right, to do this, disease surveillance. But as it turned out, right, even though that system continued to work initially, but when they were reporting cases, to the hospitals, and supposedly, right, the hospital is going to submit those information to China CDC. But that level, but you see how the upward information flow was intercepted. Right, according to Caixin, you had the provincial government officials basically delete the cases, right, when before they were reporting to the upper level.
Thank you both, and thank you, Maciej, for chiming in with a question. We have a couple questions in the chat that have to do with the timing of this sort of investigation. So based on past epidemics, maybe SARS or MERS or various influenza strains, how long does an investigation into the origin of a virus typically take? And are there cases where they just simply haven't found the origin? Is that something that we should be prepared for in this case as well? I don't know if, Gigi, do you want to start us out?
Sure, it's more typical to not know the origin of a disease outbreak, but then again, it hasn't always been like we must find the origin of a disease outbreak. It's generally assumed, like we don't know exactly the path that Ebola virus took to cause various epidemics in the last 10 years. We don't know. It's presumed that it's that it has bats as its origin. There's some other animal, and then there's that's where the outbreak starts. We don't know to which bird it was that may have tipped off a particular influenza season. We just assume that it's it's an avian flu based on the sequence, or that that there's a pig involved and that's how these epidemics start. We have the general location, like in 2009, it was it started probably in Mexico, that flu season, that pandemic, and it was detected in San Diego. So it was like we have inferences, but often you don't have the kind of certainty that a lot of people would like, and we are getting better at figuring this out. There are tools that have been developed that we're talking about different sequence changes in different in the virus in the early days, that if this were 20 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation, or maybe we would be having this conversation if samples were stored. We would have it now about an outbreak that occurred decades ago. But we don't, even though the tools are getting better, you can't rewind history and find those animals.
Yeah, and I can add to Gigi's points a bit, that it's easier to find the origin when we're talking about commercially managed animal populations, and much more difficult in wild animal populations. So the easiest situation might be a poultry farmer who gets infected with avian flu, and if those poultry on the farm have the same avian flu, then the link is immediate. if an urban resident that went to a market gets infected with avian flu, then it's harder to link back to the market and to an originating farm. And then if it's an urban resident, say, that has to be linked back to a wild animal population, that's an additional step that you have to go, and wild animal populations just aren't sampled very frequently. So that's the hardest path to trace, and that's why Gigi mentioned that often we don't find it, simply because it's very difficult.
So we have a question about the seafood market, and I'm curious about this as well. In the very earliest stages of reporting, January, February 2020, a lot of people were assuming, at least journalists, I don't know about the scientific community, but there's an assumption that the Huanan seafood market was the source of the virus. And now we've seen reports that the earliest known patients might not have had a connection to that market at all. So is this still a leading theory, or is this just one of many theories that's in play in the discussion?
I'll start. More than half of the cases had a connection to the market, and given that asymptomatic spread is a thing with this virus, that isn't the case with all viruses. That links are harder to establish. I think it's clear that the market was some sort of amplification event. But we still need to go back, and there are blood bank samples that have not been analyzed. I think that there will be more to push the timeline earlier and to get better, at least scientific evidence of some of the the origin questions. But it's hard to do those. You need cooperation. You need to have an atmosphere where it's like in good faith. We are trying to find the origin of the virus, and some people point out that some of the political nature, I'm not going to say that word correctly on a webinar ever, that it is that will hamper our ability to actually get to ground truth. And so that's at least to start the conversation.
Yeah, Maciej, did you want to chime in on this? I know you touched a little bit on the wet market idea in your introductory remarks.
Sure. I'll just say that there's no mention of any market cases that link back to November 2019. So when you trace back all the cases to the first case, the timing has to be in that mid-October, mid-November range, and we know that based on how frequently severe cases occur, how frequently deaths occur. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a rule of thumb that once you saw a death, you probably already had 1,000 cases. That was used early on to assess the degree to which the virus had begun to spread in a community. So because there's no known link going back to November, it seems that those early November cases would have had links to other markets or wildlife trade. I mean, this is a blank area with no evidence, so I'm just putting forth a few guesses. And as I mentioned, my sort of best guess is that the market, as Gigi said, was an amplification event where there were a lot of clustered cases, so it was noticed, and that it could have been something like the third or fourth or fifth generation of infections of that particular market. And that third, fourth, fifth, that's the guess part. That's what we don't know.
Okay, we have several questions in the Q&A and the comments that essentially have to do with trust. We have people asking, why would I trust anything the Chinese government tells us? Can we trust particular Chinese researcher, Shizheng Li, who's been doing research at the Wuhan lab with bat populations? And I think this really gets back to a point that Gigi had made, which is this investigation depends on believing that people, particularly the scientific community, is putting forth information freely and in good faith. And it just doesn't seem like we have trust at this point because of the political tensions, particularly between China and the US. So let's try and end on a little bit more hopeful note. Is there anything that the scientific community can do, or the US and Chinese governments can do, to increase this trust and make this investigation have a better chance of reaching an end result and helping us avoid the next pandemic? So Yanzhong, you haven't chimed in a while. We've been kind of on the hard science beat, so I'll let you start here.
Sure, be happy to. I think again, right? I think if we want to prepare better for the next disease outbreak, I think that having a thorough, in-depth, right, investigation of the origins of the pandemic, is still necessary, right? It's important. So I think the United States, certainly, I think should redouble its efforts, with like-minded countries, to push for an independent, science-based, WHO-led investigation. Right? I think China, when I think international pressure is mounting, it did respond positively to that pressure. We saw, right, that in last year, by May 2020, right, this World Health Assembly resolution, that authorized the pandemic origin probe, right, that it did respond positively to the international pressures, no matter how reluctant it was, right? But this time, I think if we want to do another round of investigation, I think this should be definitely a multilateral approach, right? But this multilateral approach should make sure, right, the WHO is in the driver's seat, right, in terms of conducting investigations and in terms of drawing conclusions, right? I think one of the issues that undermine the credibility of this previous investigation in the report is that this is a WHO, China joint study, right? And the conclusions, essentially, you have to be approved, right, by the Chinese side as well, right, before that it becomes a formal report, included in the formal report. But I think in the meantime, while recognizing and supporting, right, the WHO leadership, I think the United States should also consider, right, maybe Gigi, you are the expert on that, given that China, is basically, like saying that the U.S. military labs, could also be the origin of the outbreak. That if you keep asking, to examine our labs, why you shouldn't allow us to visit your labs? Do you have anything to hide? Well, this is basically the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson's argument, right? Essentially, they use that, to indicate that U.S. has a so-called guilty conscience, right? And to justify, the refusal to, reopen, right, international investigation, right? So, I was thinking, because so far the U.S. government has not even commented, right, on this request. It has not responded, to any such accusations. I was wondering, maybe it is time for the U.S. to respond, right, to officially to such request, asking for, this. The reciprocal visits, right? Because that happened before, right? During the Cold War, for example, right? Under actually it's toward the end of the Cold War, under the President George Bush Sr., right? The U.S. did allow the Soviet inspection of its biological facilities in exchange for the visits of the Soviet biopreparant, right, facilities, by a joint U.S. British inspection team in January 1991, right? That joint delegation indeed met with denials, evasions, obstructions, right, in conducting the investigation. But they were still able to clearly identify, the offensive nature of the Soviet biological weapons program. And furthermore, if you look at the history, right, even though the United States allowed the Soviet Union, right, to visit their lab, biological facilities, it actually gained, right, from that process. It was during that visit, right, that one of the leading Soviet scientists, right, working in the biological weapons program, Ken Alibag, right, he was convinced, by visiting U.S. biological facilities that the U.S. did not have an offensive biological weapons program. Right? He later even defected, and helped the United States to have a detailed glimpse of the former Soviet biological weapons program. So this is just maybe my premature thoughts, how maybe potentially this could what we could do to break the impasse here.
So I'll just add to that. I mean, science diplomacy has pays dividends that can sometimes be years in the future, but if the United States acts in good faith and is and tries to open labs to the extent possible and does other confidence building measures and does support the WHO in their investigation while realizing the limitations of all of these things. I mean, the WHO investigation is by nature a carefully negotiated investigation because states are sovereign. And these things are not, you don't get a chance to look at all of somebody's homework when they have borders and nuclear weapons. So there are limitations to all these things. But if the U.S. acts in good faith and presents, and presents an attitude of security by achievement, where our scientific with the way that we conduct science in the United States is in an open way, a transparent way, an ethical way. I think we have those pay dividends as well for the future, and can make the United States the place, the envy of the world, and where science can be done, and where we want and the model for governance elsewhere. So, I mean, at least that's my approach, and what I hope we can do. But there's a lot of people who have other more short-term agendas that need to we need to counter as well.
All right, Maciej, did you have anything to add on this? I know you've done a lot of research overseas, so maybe from that perspective, you can talk about what sort of cooperation is possible between international scientists.
Sure. I mean, I just want to say that these comments over the last 5 minutes from Yanzhong and Gigi are very important. So modeling this future cooperation on lessons learned. So Gigi's description of the anthrax investigation, about how it was only a US investigation, versus Yanzhong's description of these mutual bioweapons inspections that allowed for some sort of cooperation to take place. I mean, these are the places that we need to learn lessons and build some type of cooperation, again, based on science, and how long the détente will last, or will have to take place for there to be that level of cooperation. Nobody knows. I mean, it's probably several years. I worked in Vietnam for 8 years, and the protected data were around avian influenza outbreaks and avian influenza sequences. And it wasn't that it was impossible to do this research or impossible to share, but it required building trust, building relationships. The very basic research sometimes took years that you thought could have been done scientifically in weeks. And once that level of trust was established, further projects and further sharing and more collaborations became possible. But it was a years-long process, and did rely on the commitment of scientists to be open and transparent with other scientists, so that their bosses who weren't scientists and who managed this whole process could trust that it was all moving forward in the right direction and openly. So, I mean, if we get there in a few years, I think that'll be a huge success.
Okay, well, let's
not overstate though the Russian cooperation. They still have lots of facilities that they haven't let United States or anyone open, to see, and they're now on the export list for the U.S. has accused them of making biological weapons. So, small successes, but there's more work to be done.
Yeah, I'm sure what the Gigi, you know that this Swarovskov, that is the anthrax leak accident, right? You know that you have, that was 1979, I believe, right? That there was leading to the 66 death, right? The Soviet Union, right, sort of covered up that accident by saying it was like caused by contamination of a nearby, like a meat processing plant, and they did invite the U.S. Scientists, right? Well, not exactly, but a couple, including Matthew Matheson, right, who was the leading biological weapons authority, right, in the United States. But he was initially also, right, after the visit, right, convinced, actually this is indeed a natural occurring, outbreak, so it's essentially buy into the Soviet explanation of the outbreak, and it was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, when I think Yeltsin admitted, right, that it was indeed a cover-up. It was caused by a leak from a military facility. But as Gigi pointed out, even today, what this place is still not accessible, right, to the outside visitors.
If we have just 30 seconds, I'd love to just say, because Sverdlovsk has been brought up a few times as like, well, this has happened before. We've had, a laboratory leak. I just want to clarify that a biological weapons plant that is actually making anthrax by the ton and there was probably an explosion that happened there that released a lot of, a weapon that was designed to kill people into the air, and it actually killed people, and then probably got into the cattle. And so people then ate contaminated meat and got anthrax that way too. So like, a big difference in that time is that the intelligence community actually knew a lot more about what was going on there than what I think people, the sort of visibility we have now. And the declassified reports said there might have been many more than 66 people killed in that event. And so, and the Soviets, they denied it, then the Russians admitted it, and now we're back to that didn't happen. So the history has been rewritten again, and that whole event has not happened. So there's a lot of problems in the world, but that was probably not really a biosafety incident as much as it was like an arms control violation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your time. I certainly learned a lot, and I think anyone who watched this will also learn a lot. And I hope that our audience will join us for the next webinar. Maciej, Gigi, Yanzhong, thank you again for your detailed comments on this very important topic, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.